Okay, so let's go. Here's the biography, just to give you a little background. Keith Stanglin is professor of scripture and historical theology at Austin Graduate School of Theology. Dr. Stanglin earned a bachelor's degree from Oklahoma Christian University, a Master of Divinity from Harding University Graduate School of Religion, and a Doctor of Philosophy and Historical Theology from Calvin Theological Seminary. He's published numerous articles and essays in refereed journals and edited collections, including the Stone Campbell Journal, Church History, the Journal of Religious Ethics, and the Oxford Handbook of Early Modern Theology. He is also the author or editor of 7 books, including Jacob Arminius, Theologian of Grace, The Reformation to the Modern Church, A Reader in Christian Theology, and The Letter and Spirit of Biblical Interpretation. Dr. Stanglin worships with the Brentwood Oaks Church of Christ in Austin, Texas. I'm really pleased to have him. I've listened to some lectures that I've seen online and read some of his books, and so it's exciting for me to have him here and to listen to him live this evening. I'm actually going to share with you a link to the book on biblical interpretation. It's a really excellent book, and you may find it useful as well. So thank you, Keith, for being here, and I'll let you go ahead and get started.
Right. Thanks a lot, Kyle, for this invitation. It's really good to be with you all, even in this disembodied setting. Wish I could be there in person, but this is probably the next best thing. So yeah, I guess I'll just jump into it. Kyle asked me to address the topic of the history of Restorationism. History of Restorationism, I believe he said, from the early church on up to the Stone Campbell American Restoration Movement. So I hope you have your seatbelt fastened. It's going to be a crash course in a long history here, and it's in our limited time, obviously going to only include a few episodes of that history. So I'm going to just address, some things that come to my mind when I think of the history of Restorationism to help us get a better grasp of it, and then maybe end with a couple of things that I would say we want to take from this history. So I think you said I have about 45 to 50 minutes, Kyle. So if I go too long, wave your hand or whatever the equivalent is on Zoom. Is that right? About 50?
Yeah, 45. But feel free to finish your lesson. So
okay,
yeah,
I'll try to certainly wrap up by 10. I have no idea how long this will last, but it won't go longer than 10 till my part. So
thank you.
We can take questions and everything. I look forward to that. So first of all, what is a restorationist? Am I a restorationist? Are you a restorationist? I don't know how many members of Churches of Christ or of this group here would actually self-designate as a restorationist. My guess is not many. I generally try to avoid the term. It's a cumbersome word, and unless you're with people who know what it means, it's not really self-explanatory to most Christians. And even worse, I think it may be used sometimes to pigeonhole someone or dismiss maybe a whole group as primitivist or somehow backward and therefore irrelevant. So to clarify, since we're using that term in our discussion tonight, Restorationist objectively describes the churches, including Churches of Christ, that were spawned by the so-called Restoration movement. It's commonly called by scholars the Stone Campbell movement these days, though I have misgivings perhaps about the historical accuracy and propriety of that term. But Stone Campbell movement, American Restoration movement is what we're talking about. These churches and Christians sought to restore the faith and practice of the first century church in their present context. So it's a noble idea. It's one that is not unique to the American Restoration movement. Rather, Restorationism, broadly defined, is part of the lifeblood of the Protestant Reformation. We think of the Protestant Reformation beginning in the 16th century. Something like this idea lies at the foundation, in fact, of most denominations and church groups, especially in the United States. And perhaps here, every new group, religious group that has some sort of Christian connection, from Mormons to Pentecostals, justifies its existence by trying to improve the state of the church, restoring it to its pristine condition. To take an example almost at random, the following mission statement comes from the organizational minutes of the First Church of the Nazarene in Los Angeles in 1895. Quote, "We seek the simplicity and the power of the primitive New Testament church," end quote. There it is in a nutshell. And Alexander Campbell, one of our leaders in the early Restoration movement, couldn't have said it better himself. So this Protestant impulse, I want to say, is also not unique to Protestants. Christians have always been stirred by the description of the church in Acts, inspired by an affection for a golden age that was lost, but is also recoverable. So the restorationist assumption or approach, let's call it restorationism, is built on three premises that are also three chronological stages or phases. So I don't have PowerPoint slides here, but if you're taking notes or want to write anything down, this might be the main thing, or at least the first thing to write down, these three phases. The first premise or phase is that God established a unique pattern or plan for the church that was implemented in the first century, and that this first century church's doctrine and life were divinely approved. Okay, so first phase, first premise is God established the pattern or plan in the first century church for the first century church. And this is attested in the New Testament. You can, we could pull up a bunch of scriptures, but one that comes to mind is John 16:13, where Jesus says to the apostles that the Holy Spirit is going to guide them into all truth. So God gave direct knowledge to those, and through Jesus' teaching, to those who would go out and plant churches, the apostles. He gave them knowledge of the correct doctrine and practice. And once given, God did not intend for his basic plan to change. Is kind of the idea. So that's the first premise. Second premise or phase, there was a fall from this pristine state. Okay, so the second phase is the falling away or apostasy. This is also attested, or at least foretold, in the New Testament. In Galatians 1, 8, and 9, Paul warns the church not to receive any other gospel than the one that he preached to them. And the New Testament writers predicted that some would leave the way. Jesus himself talks about false prophets among his people. After the church was established in Acts 20, when Paul, speaking to the Ephesian elders, verses 28 through 30, he tells them to watch out and be on their guard, because there will be wolves who come into the flock and will attack the flock. And so these shepherds, have to watch out for the flock. And then he says, even from your own number, men will rise up speaking what has been distorted in order to turn away the disciples after them. So there's this idea that not long from now, there are going to be false teachers, not only attacking from outside the church, but even from within the church, even from within the church's leadership. 1 Timothy 4:1 says that in the latter times, some will fall away from the faith. 2 Timothy 4 says a very similar thing. So I'm not going to go on about these passages. There's so many of them in the New Testament that warn about this falling away, or at least presence of false teachers in the church. That's the second. The third premise and third phase of this is that the old pristine way can and must be restored. So we've got the pure church, we've got a falling away, and then third, we've got this idea that you can restore the old pure church. This point is really the solution to phase two, the solution to the apostasy. And it's less explicit in the New Testament. In other words, it doesn't really tell us exactly what to do, but I think it's at least implied. Now think of all three of these steps maybe with a building analogy. In fact, when we use the word restore, one of the ways we use that word in ordinary language is when we're talking about a building. Think of what restoration means and implies. You've got an original building there. It's a brand new building, nice and shiny, and it can be maintained and kept up and maybe even added to or whatever, but that building is there. But if it's neglected, it will decay. And so a building that's been neglected or just left to rot, it's dilapidated, okay? It has fallen from that original status. And then someone can come in, of course, and do a restoration of it. And when we restore something, the idea is it's not a brand spanking new building on another site. You're taking that old building that's there, okay, from the start and bringing it back to its original condition. So I think we should be interested in restoring that apostolic truth when we can, of course. And we can and should restore what was lost. This pure Christianity, the idea is that it can be easily read in the pages of the New Testament, and especially in Acts, in the epistles, where you have instructions to the churches directly. And so those are the best windows into the life of the so-called primitive church. Now, when we say primitive church, or you hear people talk about primitive, don't think cavemen or something like that, primitive. It's just an old word that means ancient or early. So I want to jump, if we've got a handle on those phases, those three premises or concepts, I want to jump into just what I would call selective history. Again, it's going to be episodic. I'm going to jump around here. But my point in all of this is to say that the restorationist impulse, the one that I've briefly described just now, is not something peculiar to 19th century American Presbyterians of Scots-Irish descent, who were mainly the people in our early Restoration movement. No, this impulse is akin to what Charles Taylor calls the urge to reform. And it's something that he traces through all of Latin Christendom, especially in medieval Western church. But I want to say also that it precedes Latin Christendom and is inherent in the faith itself. Think first of the Old Testament. There's precedent there. And think of the history of the Old Testament in these phases. Phase 1, God makes a covenant with his people, and the law is given. So you've got the people, you've got the rules for worship and regulations and laws to keep, all of these good things. Phase 2, the people break the covenant. And this is the falling away. Okay? Happened really fast there in Exodus, by the way. Phase 3, the prophet's task in the Old Testament is to call the people back to true Torah keeping. Your hearts must be circumcised, the prophets say. What does God want from you? Micah asks. But to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. What does God desire? Hosea asks. Loyal love, not sacrifice. So the prophets predict that after the exile, there will be a return to the land, a restoration of the land. but also a restoration of covenant relationship with God. And you see it reflected in many ways throughout the later Old Testament books, where they're making the past and looking back to the past and sort of making it contemporary. Chronicles is a great example of this. Chronicles probably one of the, if not the last book or books written in the Old Testament. And Chronicles is putting David and Solomon there as models for what it means to be faithful or ideal king. Models for moving forward in a post-exilic situation for these books and for this audience that came much later. All right, but they're looking back. Well, the restoration was never complete in the Old Testament. And you've got prophecies in texts like Isaiah 40 through 66 that simply were left unfulfilled. And that's where the Messiah and the New Testament church come into the story. So the New Testament church, we're skipping forward to the New Testament now. What we think of as phase one, all right, that pure, the beginning, the birth of the church, really is presented in many ways in the New Testament as phase three. This is the restoration of what God has been doing all along. That is, you've got the foretold restoration being fulfilled in the days of Jesus and the apostles. In Acts 1, when the disciples are talking to the risen Lord just before his ascension, they ask, is it at this time that the kingdom will be restored? So they're using that restoration language. In Acts 3, there's an announcement of the restoration. Times of restoration will come. So if you look through Acts, the Old Testament prophecies that are being cited as fulfilled are usually from those restoration passages in the Old Testament, that God is going to restore his people. What Acts is saying is that that restoration is now being fulfilled. What God is doing through his Messiah and the pouring out of his Spirit on all his people is the sign of that restoration of relationship with God, a covenant that welcomes Jews and Gentiles alike. Well, that's Acts, okay? Think through Paul's letters also. What is being restored is an old covenant, and I would say one that precedes the Mosaic law. For Paul, it's what's being restored is the covenant with Abraham, who he makes this point in Galatians and also in Romans. Abraham, who at the time was an uncircumcised man and was justified by faith, not by works. And so Paul, especially in Galatians, makes the point that we're going back to that covenant. The new covenant with Christ really is a restoration of that old covenant where circumcision is not important, but faith is what's important. So the new covenant in Christ is really an updated version of the old. It's like Abraham 2.0. Or as Paul says elsewhere, the second Adam. So it's in some ways phase three. Okay, well, this new covenant people of God and the faith that they profess becomes for us, maybe we might say phase one, okay, if that makes sense. This was the restoration, but this is the pure, kind of pristine apostolic church, the faith that was delivered once and for all. So in the early church, now I'm kind of heading toward, later first century here. In the early church, we see reflections of this assumption that this apostolic church is the way God wants it, and there's an authority to the faith and practice of this apostolic church. So specifically, the Lord taught his apostles, who then handed down to others this true teaching of Jesus. And the later New Testament books assume this. You don't even have to get to after the New Testament. We see it in the New Testament itself. 2 Peter 3 and verse 2 is one example where the writer looks back to recall the command given by the Lord through your apostles, he says. 2 Timothy 2 and verse 2, commands what was later called apostolic succession. There, Paul says, I'm instructing you, Timothy, who you then can instruct and entrust this to other people who can instruct others. So in 2 Timothy 2:2, you've got 4 links in this chain, or you might say 4 generations of people teaching one another. All right. Well, here are some representative snippets then from church history. When you get to 2nd century Christian writings after the New Testament, it's interesting that they all recognize that something significant ended with the apostles. Right? There was something special about the apostles in their ministry, in the church that was under their care and supervision. The apostles are like the gold standard, right? And there are several indications of this. One, besides what I just said from those later New Testament books, but one to me that's obvious when you think about it is that the office of apostle does not continue in the church. The 2nd century church does not recognize ongoing apostles. The apostles' successors, the apostles had successors in the church. They laid hands on people and entrusted them with the gospel, people like Paul to Timothy, but they didn't call those successors apostles, interestingly enough. Okay, they were bishops or elders, but not apostles. So there were bishops and elders you had in the early church. You had deacons, and they continued. That office continued, just like it did in the 1st century. We had teachers, even prophets in the 2nd century church, but not apostles. The apostles represented a unique ministry because of their firsthand connection to Jesus. The doctrine associated with them and the congregations that they founded, and the books that were associated with them and their companions, all of these became authoritative for the church's continued faith and practice, standards that they could look back to and reform themselves on the basis of. So that will be what the church instinctively will look back toward in its anytime it needs to reform or restore. So a few examples here from the 2nd century church. Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius died around the year 115. So we're talking about somebody who was very early. We have 7 of his letters. And he draws throughout the letters, if you just read that body of documents, he's always drawing a distinction between the apostles and himself and his own generation of bishops. You've got the apostles and their authority, and then we've got our subordinate authority, subordinate to the teaching of the apostles. The same goes for Polycarp of Smyrna and all the so-called apostolic fathers. These are the people who are in the first generation after the apostles. They already immediately recognized that they are not continuing the ministry of the apostles in the exact same way as they do continue to minister to churches. By the mid-2nd century, there were a number of different accounts of Christian doctrine circulating around. So what we would now call competing doctrines or heresies even. Some of you may have heard of some of these. Gnosticism is the main one that you may have heard of. But if you haven't, it's okay. My point here is that we've got different doctrines floating around, and even later, different books than the ones that we have in our New Testament going around. And the question is, how do you know where these came from, and how do you know which one is the authentic gospel? Well, one mid-2nd century Christian writer named Justin, later called Justin Martyr, claims that these heretics or false teachers came later than the apostles. It's the same really in philosophical schools, he explains in one of his writings. You've got later followers of a true philosopher who end up inventing their own different schools of philosophy. And so wrong interpretations of a philosopher's teachings come later. The truer is earlier. Another, probably the most famous second century Christian theologian, late second century, is Irenaeus. Irenaeus of Lyon said that the truth about God and Christ is a single truth. And the various and diverse teachings that have arisen since then are distortions of the truth. And so he asks, in the face of this diversity of doctrines, how do you know which of all the competing claims and accounts is the true one? He says, trace it back through apostolic succession to the apostles. Okay, so I want you to see there's a restorationist impulse there. What the apostles taught and what their immediate successors taught in the churches founded by apostles. This, for Irenaeus, is the rule of faith that is true and therefore authoritative for the church in his day. So all I'm trying to establish here in these examples is that the impulse to go back to the earliest church was there from the beginning. There was always the idea that going back to restore the faith and practice of the early church was a good thing. Another second, early third century Christian writer named Tertullian, in one of his books, claimed a presumptive principle against heresies universally. And my translation of it is this, quote, whatever is first is true. Whatever is later is impure, end quote. So for Tertullian, a criterion of truth, therefore, is antiquity. How old is it? Okay. The idea is that the true standard was original, and any heresy or false teaching is a falling away from that original truth. Okay. You can't move from something false to something true. The true had to come first out of Jesus' mouth and the apostles' mouths and pens, and then the false is a distortion of that truth. Okay. Just a couple of examples. The stream is purer as you move upstream, closer to the source, the fount. Okay. As the stream goes downstream, other things come in and can pollute it along the way. Right. Or maybe some of you know the old telephone game, like rumors. You start a message and you pass it on to somebody else, and as that message gets passed on down the line, things get distorted or not heard exactly right or not passed on exactly right. Things added to it that weren't there in the beginning, other things omitted from the message, and hopefully unintentionally, all of these things. Okay. So it's sort of a similar idea to those things. There is a famous statement by Vincent of Lerins in the 5th century, as he's trying to define what orthodoxy is, not the content of it, but just what the word orthodoxy and what that means in the church. He says, orthodoxy is, quote, that which has been believed everywhere, always, and by all. All right. It's that always there. What's been believed always, that implies something that goes back to ancient traditions. So it's a typical idea throughout church history. Even as the articulation of doctrine developed in the medieval church, okay, the Middle Ages here, there was an enduring nostalgia for the church's life recorded in the book of Acts. So monks and clergy both especially sought to conform to the early church's way of life. One of my favorites here, and this actually comes from some pandemic lockdown reading. I don't know if you've all had a little more time to do some reading, but I would recommend getting some good books and cuddling up with them if you're still locked down or in quarantine. One of mine had been on my list for a while, and that is The Ecclesiastical History of the Venerable Bede. This is a man in England. He died in the year 735, and he's writing a history of Christianity as it came to England in the very early years. And it just struck me as I was reading through, and this is just one example that's typical, okay? It's just fresh on my mind, is why I'm raising him. But it just struck me that he talks about and uses this phrase, the apostolic life in the primitive church. And when he does it, he's talking about people who are trying to model or live their own lives according to the model of the apostolic life or the primitive church. I'll just give you some examples. He says that when Augustine of Canterbury arrived in Kent, and this was around the year 600, he's reporting this, that he and his companions returned to the apostolic life of the primitive church. Now that's interesting. And I think it's interesting to ask them what the narrator, Bede, meant by that phrase, that these men and Augustine and his companions returned to the apostolic life of the primitive church. What do you think he means by that? What did that look like? A cappella singing? Taking the Lord's Supper every Sunday? It's not what he mentioned. Now, they were doing those things, so there's no need to mention those things. But that's not what he meant by that. For him, for those monks, it was about devotion to prayer and preaching and having meager possessions and a willingness to suffer. That's how he described the apostolic life that they returned to. Again, Pope Gregory I in the year 601 wrote a letter to this Augustine of Canterbury, addressing the behavior of bishops and how to handle the church offerings. And he ordered them, and this is a quote, to follow that manner of living that was used in the beginning at the birth of the church among our fathers. All things were common to them, end quote. So in this case, the early church was a model for how to treat possessions and hold all things in common. You may recall that this is Acts 2 and Acts 4. Maybe not an important part of our restoration movement all the time, but it was for them. Just one more example from Bede. An abbess named Hild governed a monastery in Whitby in the late 7th century. And Bede comments that she and the sisters there followed the example of the primitive church. How? Again, I ask, what does he mean by that? For them, he says, they held all things in common. So every time that Bede in this ecclesiastical history mentions following the example of the primitive church, what we might call restoration, it has to do with the practice of holding all things in common. Maybe more aspects, but at least that, like we see in Acts 2 and 4. Well, Acts was actually not a very popular book in the early church, but it came to have more influence throughout the medieval period. And I think you see that beginning here in the 7th and 8th century with Bede. Well, trying to maybe skip a little more here and hurry up the rest of this history. Monastic and clerical reform took a leap forward in the 11th century, usually in moral reforms. One medieval historian says that in the 11th century, there was a common, troubling sense that the Christian faith had fallen away from its primordial rigor. So the phrase that we saw in Bede's 8th century work pops up again over and over in the late medieval period. That is the apostolic life. And it became synonymous with poverty, a life of poverty and the sharing of goods. There was sometimes, I would say, a blurry line between Orthodox monks and dissenting groups. but all of them were inspired by the life of Christ and the apostles. And so we have new monastic orders that were being established to emphasize the vow of poverty and to live that so-called apostolic life. So the Dominicans, the Franciscan monks. Skipping ahead some more, the Renaissance movement was a sort of restorationism too. You may know that the rallying cry of the Renaissance humanists in the 14th and 15th centuries was ad fontes. That's Latin for to the fountains, to the sources. They wanted to go back to the originals. This was intended in a linguistic and literary context, but it also affected biblical studies. And so they began to go back to the original languages of the Bible, not just read the Bible in Latin, but in Hebrew and in Greek, and discern the original text. That sentiment also translated into church matters. And so reformers came along in the 16th century especially and wanted to get rid of innovations in the church's faith and practice, especially those that were recent to them and they felt were harmful to faith and good piety. At the Council of Constance, this is 1414 to 1418, the cry for reformation was taken for granted. And so the council called for, quote, the reformation of church, head and members. Well, a century later, what we now call the Protestant Reformation would begin. The Restorationist sentiment took hold especially among radical reformers, and in England, the so-called Puritans, who sought to purify the church of liturgical and other ecclesial practices that were not sanctioned in the New Testament. So the Puritans wanted to go back to the New Testament and purify the church on the basis of the Bible. This idea of restoration, then, I'm just trying to point out in all of these examples, is it's prevalent in the Reformation and especially in England. Okay, one of my favorite examples of this is from a book that was published in 1678 by Thomas Grantham, and you hear the language and concepts simply in the title of his book. Now, I'm going to read the title of his book. You have to bear with me here. This is back when the titles of books served also as the advertisements for the books and almost the table of contents. But here's the title of Thomas Grantham's book, Christianismus Primitivus, or the Ancient Christian Religion in its nature, certainty, excellency, and beauty, internal and external, particularly considered, asserted, and vindicated from the many abuses which have invaded that sacred profession by human innovation or pretended revelation, comprehending likewise the general duties of mankind in their respective relations, and particularly the obedience of all Christians to magistrates and the necessity of Christian moderation about things dispensable in matters of religion, with divers cases of conscience discussed and resolved. All right. Well, I guess the main point there was, especially the beginning, primitive Christianity, the ancient Christian religion that is purified from all of these abuses that have invaded. So, you've got continuing restoration movements. One of my favorites also, and then I'll try to wrap things up with a couple of things maybe we can learn from this. But one of my favorites is one of the Presbyterians from the early to mid 18th century. His name is John Taylor. And he was one of many Presbyterians who were ordained in the Presbyterian Church, but without subscribing to the Presbyterian Confession of Faith. It's called the Westminster Confession of Faith. They would be ordained, which normally you would subscribe to their church confession, but these were ordained without that. Okay, and when he was ordained in 1716, he said this, and they passed him, but he said, "I will, in a manner consistent with Christian love and charity, maintain the truths of the gospel, especially such as are beyond controversy, determined in the Holy Scriptures." So something like, I subscribe to this confession inasmuch as it agrees with Scripture. And then in a sermon from 1756, a much older Taylor said, and here's a long quote, but listen to this, see if this sounds familiar. John Taylor says, "We are Christians and only Christian, a name which in its original and true meaning includes all that is virtuous and amiable, just and good, noble and divine, excellent and heavenly. Christians is the honorable name we wear as a glorious diadem upon our heads, in token of the favor of the Father of the universe, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Episcopalians, Presbyterians, Independents, Baptists, Calvinists, Arminians, Arians, Trinitarians, and others are names of religious distinctions. But, however we may commonly be ranked under any of these divisions, we reject them all. We disown all connection, excepting that of love and goodwill, with any sect or party whatsoever. We are a society built and established, not upon any human foundation, but only upon the foundation of the prophets and apostles, of which Jesus Christ is the chief cornerstone. We are Christians and only Christians, and we consider all our fellow Protestants of every denomination in the same light, only as Christians, and cordially embrace them all in affection and charity as such, whatever peculiar tenets they may hold, or in what respects soever they may differ from us. Such tenets and such difference we consider not as affecting their Christian character and profession in general." End long quote there. But that sounds exactly like the American reformers who would begin what we call the American Restoration movement over 50 years later. In fact, Alexander Campbell owned one of John Taylor's books, not the book that appears in. I couldn't find that, but I have found that he was aware, at least had in his library, in his personal library, John Taylor. So just to sum up, the Restoration movement, of which Churches of Christ are a part, did not arise out of a vacuum. People had been going back to the early church ever since there was an early church, right? And more specifically, the 19th century reformers drew on many ideas that were commonplace in 18th century English-speaking Christianity. The unity of believers, especially against what at that time was the proliferation of denominations in the wake of societal conflict and fragmentation. The authority of the Bible only as the window into that New Testament church. You've got Presbyterian dissenters really setting a model for Thomas and Alexander Campbell and Barton Stone in the Restoration movement. Presbyterian dissenters who would not subscribe to the Westminster Confession of Faith, who rejected what's sometimes called the 5 points of Calvinism, all right? And then religious societies. We have in the 1700s, the Methodists, we have Pietists, all of whom wanted to reform or renew the church from within without becoming a separate denomination. Well, all of these characteristics were part of the air breathed. Well, you've been a very attentive bunch, probably because you're muted and I can't tell. But a couple of things I want to wrap up here with what maybe we can learn from all of this. Two things. One, restoration is an ongoing process. Restoration is an ongoing process. An important question then, so a lot of things come to mind here. An important question has to do with what needs restoring. Along with forms of worship and church government, what if we gave as much attention to fervent prayer, to proclamation of the word? What if we restored the early church's willingness to suffer everything for truth? What if we restored the first century church's attitude toward money and possessions? What we learn here from this history is that different people see different things to restore from the early church. So maybe a fuller restoration is in order for us. One of the goals of the American Restoration movement, as I alluded to a few moments ago, was unity. They wanted to be a unity movement. And the way to get that unity, they thought, was to restore the church on the basis of the New Testament only. Well, as we seek further restoration, we should, I think, this is my opinion now, uphold those practices that we have restored from the early church that are intended for simplicity and unity, and lean toward those practices that lean toward what I would call an ecumenical baseline, right? So things like a cappella singing, things like the baptism of believers by immersion, things like the Lord's Supper every Sunday. These are not innovations in the history of the church. These are practices that were with the church from the very beginning and for centuries from the founding of the church. And so what I mean by they are a basis for unity is that no one disagrees with a cappella singing. Okay, people may add to that, they may add instruments, but everybody and all Christians can sing. No one disagrees with baptism by immersion. Other churches have other procedures. They might sprinkle or pour water, but even they would say, yeah, immersion is the norm, right? And the other is an exception to that, and one that came later, right? So there are lots of practices like that the churches of Christ in particular have traditionally held on to, and I would say are pretty good practices. There's more to say about all those, of course, but those are just some things that come to mind. A second point here may be more along the lines of an admonition, but I want to say that whatever we mean by restorationism, our fall narrative should not be such that it precludes us from learning from our forebears throughout church history. So let me unpack that a little bit. What I'm doing here to end is basically unpacking that phase 2, that fall narrative, the apostasy of the church, that the institutional church fell away at some point. Well, depending on who you ask, there are many variations on when that happened, what happened, what precipitated it, and to what degree that fall was. So how early or late do we place that apostasy? And how sudden and how precipitous is the fall? How partial or complete was it? Obviously, these are complex questions, and it's unlikely that anyone or everyone, let's say, who buys the fall narrative is going to agree precisely on how to answer all those questions. Martin Luther and other of the 16th century magisterial reformers tended to think of the main problems and innovations in the church happening in recent centuries. So 13th, 14th centuries on up to their time in the 16th century. Other radical reformers tended to put the apostasy much earlier and much more firm, okay, much more concrete, much more suddenly. Especially if they dated it, they would really focus on when the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian and united church and empire. The union of church and state was for many radical reformers where it all went south. Churches of Christ have tended to have, I would say, one of the more extreme accounts. And I don't know what all experience others have had, but I grew up hearing that the institutional church, that is the church that otherwise fought heresies, was itself problematic by the second century, by the early second century. The first widespread falling away from the New Testament pattern was when the single bishop was distinguished from the multiple elders. And that happened in the early second century, and it went downhill from there. Again, the point that I heard growing up was that this fall was not limited to small groups whom the church called heretics. The apostasy, so the story goes, encompassed the institutional church at large. Well, think about what the consequence of that is. There are many, but what I want to focus on is that among churches of Christ, the traditional narrative has emphasized the history of Christianity after the apostolic age as the account of a sudden and precipitous fall. And as a result, in their efforts to restore New Testament Christianity, churches of Christ have, for the most part, ignored church history. So on this account, church history, if it's to be studied at all, is to be studied as a series of cautionary tales of what not to do and where it can all go wrong. Well, in this understanding, then, the call is to restore on the basis of the New Testament alone. And if you're only going back to the New Testament, then you skip over church history, a history that is at best superfluous to the task of restoration, and at worst, just a negative thing, a lot of bad stuff in that history. Again, this phenomenon is not unique to churches of Christ. I think we're on the extreme end of that, but it's fairly common among evangelical Protestants at large. So I want to end just by saying that the scheme of avoiding our history is unworkable. And ignoring the past doesn't mean that we're not affected by it. And acknowledging that the church developed after the apostolic era does not mean that we can't learn some positive things from it. I mean, imagine if I said because Ignatius of Antioch advocated one bishop instead of multiple bishops, one bishop above the other elders, that I somehow, because of that, justify ignoring Ignatius' letters and all the wonderful things he has to say about Christ, and he was on the way actually to suffering martyrdom, all the great things that he says in those letters. Imagine if I ignored that because I disagree with him about this one thing. Imagine if we ignored reading all the great figures throughout church history because we didn't quite agree with them on everything. Well, we don't ignore each other in our churches. And I don't think we probably agree on every single matter that we could discuss. So I would say restorationism can lend itself to a very negative view of church history. And restorationism is fine, I would say, as long as we engage in our Bible studies, engage in our church life, engage in our personal faith, inviting these voices from the history of the church into that conversation. There's a lot of wisdom in the past, a lot of perspective to be had that as restorationists, I'm afraid we sometimes have missed out on. All right, Kyle, I think that is about 50 minutes. So I'm going to end there and let you take over or answer questions or whatever.